Hello and welcome to the Project Doctor podcast. My name is Ralph Goossens and I'm your project management expert, presenting you with all the things you need to know about project management. Project Doctor is here to provide you with expert analysis and with recipes that you can put to practical use immediately after the podcast, so stay tuned. I'm very glad to hear that so many of you have already shown up. So let's get started right away. This is the 6th episode of the Project Doctor podcast, where we're covering the various styles of the project canvas. In this episode, we're talking about requirements and design. So, have you ever been surprised by requirements suddenly popping up when the deliverables are already halfway being built? Or finding out that the design is not that 100% complete after all? Happens to all of us, so keep listening. I'll be sharing some insights on how you could prevent that from happening. There are, as always, some extras to this episode, so don't forget to visit projectdoctor.online to download your extras on the key tools that we are discussing. First, let's start with a question: what are requirements anyway? And what are they not? I really like this topic of requirements for several reasons. Mostly the project is still quite fresh when you're dealing with the requirements, so I'm full of energy, a bit like a puppy actually. Also because requirements seem simple at first, just go and gather the requirements and then do the hard work. But actually, it usually gets quite complicated if you dive a bit deeper into it. And that's something that I really like, using my analytical skills for good requirements and a solid design. In general, there are two areas for which requirements can apply. It can be related to the end product of the project, the deliverables, but it can also be related to the process that your project has to follow. In this podcast episode, however, I'll focus only on the requirements for the deliverables, as process requirements are quite a different beast. So back to the question: what are requirements actually? And how are they different from the goal of the project? Requirements are part of a solution, so they are actually a partial specification of that solution. In terms of means and ends, the goal of your project, of course, is the end, and any solution is only one of the possible means to get there. As the saying goes, there's only one Rome, but many roads can bring you there. In my personal history, the book Principles of Software Engineering Management by Tom Gilp was quite an outstanding book. It describes a solution as the set of ideas, the implementation of which impacts at least one part of the problem positively. And this definition, I think, actually sounds more like a warning a bit. It implies that requirements or solutions are generally incomplete because it talks about part of the problem. And it also implies that they may actually have a negative impact on the problem. Why else would you talk about impacting the problem positively? So could your requirements actually work against you? Yes, madam, sir, that is possible. You can have requirements that contradict one another. We'll see later in this podcast how to find out in a structured way if that is the case, by using a technique called quality function deployment. But before we get there, a key tool for managing the requirements is to think of them as attributes, things that the solution must have. And then also think of requirements as organized in a tree-like structure, a real breakdown. So that also means that if you document the requirements as a requirements tree or an attribute tree, you'll already be one step on the way. When I started out my career, I've done quite a bit of requirements gathering and analysis. And initially, I would just write them down as text in a Word document like most people. But after reading Tom Gilp's book, I started to use other tools where I could really put them into a tree-like structure, a breakdown. And that's been very, very helpful for me. I've always been a reader for inspiration, so I'll be pointing you to some more books in the various episodes of this podcast. In general, we can see two types of requirements. There are functional requirements that, if implemented, will give the solution some characteristics that are directly impacting the goals of the project. So they are like primary. And there are non-functional requirements, which are a threshold that must be met in order for the solution to be workable. To give an example from a software project, which is where my background is, of course, you'll have guessed that, the functional requirements will be anything that is visible to the user. As an example that everybody could relate to, for a new email system, the functional requirements would include that you can group the emails by conversation, or you can sort them by date that you've received them or by sender, or that you can search for keywords in the email subject or in the body. These are things that are visible to the user, of course. Non-functional requirements could include that you can install the software on either an iPhone or an Android. And if there was a requirement for end-to-end encryption, it would depend on the goal of the project if I would consider that to be a functional or a non-functional requirement. For your reference, there is an ISO standard for non-functional requirements in software, ISO 25010, and it differentiates between quality of the product and quality in use. You can find a link to that ISO standard on the website projectdoctor.online. Let's also take an example from a social project. And here the functional requirements could be that the participants follow a training leading to a diploma or a certificate. So the training here would be a functional requirement because it would be one aspect of the goal of the project, which could be to better prepare the participants for an entry-level job. In this case, a non-functional requirement might be that the training could be made available online due to the corona pandemic, for example. All right, so now I've been discussing what requirements are and what they are not. So let's now take a look at how to gather them, because requirements are not just there, they must be harvested. They're not readily available at the start of a project. In general, there are two sources for requirements. The sponsor definitely will have some ideas related to the goal of the project, and I've discussed goals in episode 2 of this podcast. And you will have the end users who will have to work with the deliverables from the project. And I've been discussing end users in the 4th episode. Remember that I mentioned that requirements can contradict one another? So given that both the sponsor and the end users are main sources for requirements, there's a reason for possible contradiction, of course, because their interests, either immediate or long-term, are possibly never fully aligned. Okay, so which techniques for requirements gathering are there? You cannot do without talking, and this is why interview skills are key for project managers. First and foremost, interview the people in the workplace, and I surely recommend that you do that. Apart from all the information you're collecting, I've always found it very satisfying to just walk around the company and talk to a lot of people, asking them questions, hearing their stories. It's a great way to find hidden requirements. Also, I'm a curious guy. I like to learn, and just asking some trigger questions and then listening, that's a great way to learn for sure. This is one of those settings where work and play are the same for me. But back to our topic of requirements gathering, the sponsor obviously is another primary source for the requirements, and she or he will have some suggestions directly related to the goal of the project. The next part of requirements gathering is also to validate them, and especially requirements that have been coming from the end users must be cross-checked with the project goal and must be confirmed by the sponsor. After all, she or he is paying for all of this. If the requirements that came from the end users contradict requirements that came from the sponsor, there's an interesting bit of alignment to be done here. Either the sponsor must agree that she overlooked something important, or the end users must be convinced that some of their requirements will not make it into the design, and therefore also not into the deliverables of their project. Here is, again, an important role for the project manager to make sure that sponsor and end users get some basic alignment. If not, end users will revolt, and you'll definitely have a hard time to bringing the project to a good end. But then also the sponsor will have a hard time getting the expected value from the end results of the project, because the end users will work against that. So this alignment around the requirements in the early phases of the project is absolutely important. As another live example, in one of my projects, the goal was to build a new in-store application for a chain of bookshops. And there was a quite surprising requirement coming from the end users because they wanted to stay with a character-based user interface. And this was in a time when Windows was already on all computers. So the CEO and the sponsor thought that this would look very old-fashioned. But the users were able to convince him that actually it worked faster for them and that they could maintain eye contact with the customers in the store because they could search for titles and order the books while keeping eye contact with the clients. While a graphical user interface would force them to look at the screen to locate the mouse and the buttons, etc. So you see, requirements are not always obvious, and sometimes they can be counterintuitive. The next step after gathering the requirements is to give them some relative importance, a weighting factor. One common way is to use the MSCW or Moscow model. M for must have, S for should have, C for could have, and W for won't have. So, as we saw already a bit earlier, depending on if you're talking to the sponsor or the end user, they may have very different opinions on the importance of a requirement. In the end, the sponsor decides because that's the person paying. And this is also why the W for won't have is coming in handy, because it allows me to document a requirement that won't make it and still recognize the fact that it was brought up as a requirement up front. Priorities for requirements also are an important tool for scope control, because it tells you what things could be dropped first if you get into a time squeeze or resources are getting low. And by the way, I'll be talking more about resources in an upcoming episode of this podcast. Now, before I move on to design, let's summarize what has been said about requirements. We've seen what are they, a partial specification toward a solution. We've seen types of requirements, functional and non-functional. We've discussed gathering the requirements, talking to the sponsor and to the end users. And we've discussed documenting the requirements, the importance of putting them in a tree structure to get a breakdown from high level to more detailed requirements, and finally to indicate their priority. The next step is translating requirements into a design. Once you have them all gathered, there is again a two-step process, the high-level design and the detailed design. In IT, that's a common approach, but of course, depending on the subject matter area or the industry that you are in, this could be quite different procedures with different approaches and templates and protocols. Some industries may have regulations, quite strict on how designs are structured and documents, or there will be standards that are generally accepted. The only common thing that I want to say about design is that no matter the protocol or standard, it is always a translation of the requirements. From the step of what is required to how should it work and be constructed. And then the design in general is the guideline for the next phase, which is the build/develop/construct. An important thing here is to validate the design against requirements. And a good practice to use, no matter how your design is documented, is to trace it against the requirements. What I mean with tracing is that for every requirement, you should have a cross-reference where in the design it is covered. And for every design element, you should have a cross-reference which requirement it is supposed to cover. Because you want to know from very early on if all the requirements are actually there in the design, but also conversely, if there is stuff in the design that nobody has actually been requiring. And that could happen for sure. I want to mention one tool that I've been using regularly and that I've not come across in other IT projects. Not sure why, maybe because it was developed in the car making industry and tools don't easily cross industry borders. Not sure. But what I do know is that this tool definitely can be used in IT too, and that it would bring great value. It is called QFD, which is short for Quality Function Deployment. It's a tool to cross-reference requirements and design elements in a bit more advanced way. So what do I mean by that? It not just cross-references, but also analyzes for how much each design element contributes to the requirements, even negatively. And we've touched on this subject also in the beginning, where we have seen that requirements could contradict one another. And the QFD tool actually is a structured way to find out where and how that's happening. To end with a simple example, in one of my projects there was a requirement for user-specific configurability and another requirement for fast performance. In the initial high-level design, the way to get configurability was that the software would call lots of small modules in a specific order based on the user preference or the user profile. By using the QFD tool to validate this design, the team quickly concluded that this particular solution for configurability would be very bad for performance. So that part of the design was changed in a very early phase, and we found that out by using the QFD tool. So let's wrap up this episode. What have we seen and covered and learned? We've seen what requirements actually are, a partial specification toward a solution. We've seen two types of requirements, the functional and the non-functional ones. We've seen that the sponsor and the end user communities are the main sources for requirements and that they may contradict. We've seen how to document requirements, to always use a tree structure or a breakdown. And we've discussed on how to validate requirements against the design, to cross-reference it and to use the QFD tool. So for all of these, there are a few examples and additional materials on the website projectdoctor.online. So please go there and visit. Hope you enjoyed this episode and speak to you again in the next one. Bye-bye.